Breakfast was still warm when Grace Murphy disappeared in the swampside neighborhood of Houma, Louisiana, population 11,432. The June morning unfolded with a heavy blanket of humid air over the red dirt road, summer heat rising from the grass still holding the night's dew. At 7:42 a.m., Grace's neighbor, Mrs. Lorraine Guidry, waved through her kitchen window as the 11-year-old girl carried a small paper bag across the narrow strip of yard, separating their two modest wooden homes. Grace was returning the paper bag that Mrs. Lorraine had lent her the night before, a bag with faded patterns and worn creases that the older woman had kept for more than 2 decades. The elderly woman watched Grace's figure fade behind the low trees, the blue ribbon in the girl's hair the last splash of color before she vanished around the curve where a brown pickup truck sat silently parked. What happened in the next 12 minutes would haunt Houma for 25 years. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you like this video, don't forget to hit subscribe. In 1975, Louisiana was still a place where life moved slowly and community trust played a central role, especially in the town of Houma in Terrebonne Parish, where dirt roads, low wooden houses, and the sound of outboard motors in the swamps formed the familiar backdrop of Cajun life. Violent crime was rare, children walked the neighborhood without adult supervision, and family-owned stores like Rouse's Market were daily destinations for local residents. In a society without Amber Alerts, security cameras, or high levels of surveillance, safety was taken for granted. The Murphy family lived on the edge of town in a small, simple but stable wooden house. Elizabeth worked as a cashier, Michael was often away working on oil rigs, and their 2 children, Grace and Daniel, were far more independent than modern kids their age. Grace Murphy, 11 years old, was a quiet, reserved girl who was used to walking to the store a few times a week to run small errands for her mother. Her route was almost always the same, straight out from the house to the main road, then turning into the residential area and crossing an old rotting fence to reach the store just a few hundred yards away. That morning was no different, except for a few small but notable details that the family didn't fully grasp at the time. Daniel had noticed for 2 days prior an old brown Ford F-100, parked near the corner, appearing at odd times like early morning or late afternoon, and the man driving it was not a familiar face in this small community. A neighbor had also casually mentioned to Elizabeth that a middle-aged man had stopped to ask for directions to Barrow Street, a place not typically visited by strangers. On the morning Grace went missing, when Elizabeth asked her daughter to go buy a few items for lunch, Grace hesitated very briefly, but nodded, and left the house with her change purse as usual. Daniel stood on the porch watching her, just as the F-100 slowly drove past the end of the street once more. It caught his attention, but not enough to raise alarm, since in a small town, unfamiliar vehicles occasionally appeared. Grace began walking her familiar route, crossing the neighbor's yard, and heading toward the wooden fence. That was the only stretch hidden from view from the Murphy house. At this blind spot, Grace vanished. Daniel heard a faint sound like a car door closing, but couldn't pinpoint the direction. When Grace didn't appear at the end of the road, as usual, Daniel thought she might have taken a detour or stopped at a classmate's house. In the first 20 minutes, worry didn't fully set in. This was the period when the family misjudged the severity. After more than half an hour, with no sign of Grace returning, Elizabeth began walking the route her daughter usually took, calling her name repeatedly and enlisting a few neighbors to check nearby alleys. A little girl living nearby said she thought she saw Grace standing next to a brown truck, but couldn't remember any more details. This fragmentary information wasn't enough to guide the search. Nearby homes were knocked on, backyards quickly checked, and the dirt road behind the fence was briefly inspected, but no trace of Grace was found. Nearly an hour after Grace left home, all spontaneous search efforts led to dead ends. No footprints, no sounds, no evidence that Grace had passed that stretch after becoming hidden from view. Realizing the situation no longer fit the pattern of a typical lost child, Elizabeth decided to call 911, marking the official start of a serious missing person case in a town as uneventful as Houma. When Elizabeth's call connected to 911, the dispatcher logged it as a child missing report in a short time frame, but with high urgency, since the victim had left home less than an hour earlier, with no signs of leaving voluntarily. The information was immediately forwarded to the Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's Office dispatch system, with priority coding for a minor potentially in danger. The nearest patrol unit was assigned to the Murphy home, while another team was directed to the last known sighting area for an initial sweep. Upon arriving at the scene, the deputies confirmed the timeline between the family's statements and the dispatch log to ensure accuracy in building the chronology and avoid discrepancies. After the initial assessment, police concluded that the likelihood of Grace wandering off on her own was very low based on her personality and habits, as described by the family. Daniel provided details about the sound heard near the blind spot right after Grace turned behind the fence, leading police to seriously consider the involvement of a motor vehicle. Information about the brown Ford F-100, Daniel observed that same morning, combined with its multiple appearances around the neighborhood, was noted in the report as a key detail for cross-verification. Police quickly analyzed the local social context. Houma was a low-density town, where an unfamiliar vehicle, appearing repeatedly in the same area, was noteworthy, especially coinciding with the disappearance. The team raised questions about the possibility of prior stalking of Grace, based on the recurring suspicious vehicle and the timing of the approach. The fact that family and neighbors had searched for nearly an hour, without finding any trace, further supported the view that Grace couldn't have simply gotten lost without leaving any signs of movement in the immediate area. Based on the era's criteria for assessing child disappearances, including time away from home, victim personality, presence of suspicious elements, and speed of vanishing, the responding unit immediately classified the case as high severity and treated abduction as the primary hypothesis. Police conducted formal statements from Elizabeth and Daniel at the scene. Elizabeth provided the time Grace left, what she was wearing, and the purpose of her trip, while Daniel recounted sequentially what he saw and heard, including the strange vehicle and the metallic door sound. Though the statements were fragmented due to both witnesses' emotional stress, police recorded them fully for timeline construction. The team determined an urgent search perimeter needed to be established before dark. A map of the area was marked with key points: where Grace left home, the blind spot where she vanished, the direction the suspicious vehicle had been seen heading, and nearby areas where an offender could quickly take a victim, such as side roads out of the neighborhood or paths leading to the swamp. One group was assigned to re-walk Grace's usual route, another to check vacant lots, and the area behind the fence where Daniel lost sight of his sister. Deputies were deployed in a concentric circle pattern, centered on the blind spot, expanding the search radius segment by segment. The goal was to collect any initial evidence before daily activity disturbed the scene. All data was compiled at a temporary command vehicle parked in front of the Murphy home to keep information flowing smoothly in the critical first hours. With the recorded factors, the sudden disappearance, suspicious vehicle, lack of traces at the scene, and extremely rapid timeline, police determined this required immediate action to maximize chances of finding the victim alive. The on-scene investigation unit began recreating Grace's movements based on Elizabeth and Daniel's statements, treating this as the foundation for narrowing the search area and determining potential vehicle access. Grace's daily route was mapped from the Murphy front door, along the main street, past 3 consecutive houses, then left to the wooden fence, separating the residential area from an unused lot. This point was where visibility from homes was blocked, and where Daniel lost visual contact with Grace. The investigation team walked the entire route, noting road surface characteristics, fence height, distances between observation points, and the number of home windows facing the path. Cross-referencing statements with the physical layout showed Grace was only visible to witnesses in the initial stretch, while the area near the blind spot lacked any natural oversight. The team identified this as the focal area because the likelihood of an offender exploiting it for undetected approach was very high. Measuring the distance from the Murphy home to the fence helped analyze Grace's walking speed. Based on the route length and Elizabeth's reported departure time, the moment Grace passed the blind spot aligned with when Daniel heard the metallic car door sound. This alignment was noted as crucial evidence for pinpointing the offender's approach timing. Measurements using steps matching Grace's stature showed the time she spent in the blind spot was long enough for a vehicle to stop, open a door, and leave without drawing significant attention, especially with tall bushes on both sides and most homes lacking views of that section. The investigation team created a zoned map, dividing the route into 3 segments: the easily observable section near home, the partially obscured section with some open sightlines, and the fully hidden section behind the wooden fence. This division helped assess where an offender could have observed Grace beforehand. At the street corner where Daniel had noticed the Ford F-100, it was marked as a potential observation point, as it allowed the driver to see Grace's entire starting path without lingering too long. Another position was identified at a nearby intersection, a few dozen yards away, where a vehicle could turn around unobtrusively. Lines of sight from these points showed an offender could monitor Grace from afar and accurately time when she reached the blind spot. Scene analysis revealed the fence area had uneven ground, tall grass, and few footprints, since locals rarely entered it, making it suitable for a vehicle to approach slowly, without easy detection. This was corroborated by cross-checking directions some witnesses described the strange vehicle taking in prior days. Witnesses noted the truck often moved slowly past the Murphy area, strengthening the hypothesis that the offender had stalked Grace's routine beforehand and knew her movements. The investigation team analyzed the time window of Grace's disappearance, the interval from the last sighting to when Daniel went to check. This was calculated by having Daniel walk the route at Grace's pace and noting when he reached the fence. The remaining time was deemed sufficient for a vehicle to stop, approach Grace at close range without loud noise, then turn around or accelerate away. Spatial temporal analysis indicated the offender most likely stopped beside the fence, where there was enough clearance to open a door without being seen by residents. The team also verified 3 escape routes a vehicle could use within 1 minute of approaching Grace: the road to the main artery, a side path to vacant land, and a little-used shortcut south of town. The existence of these exits reduced the effectiveness of immediate pursuit and explained why initial spontaneous searchers found no vehicle traces after Grace vanished. The complete route reconstruction led the team to conclude that Grace reaching the blind spot was the decisive factor, enabling the offender to act swiftly and leave the scene before anyone realized she was missing. The analyzed route map was pinned to the field command board and became the foundation for subsequent steps involving physical evidence, witnesses, and the suspicious vehicle. The investigation team deployed ground search operations immediately after completing the reconstruction of the route, starting from the blind spot area and expanding in concentric circles marked on the map. The deputies divided the search route into small segments, conducting visual sweeps along grassy areas, dirt ledges, drainage ditches, and low-traffic zones. One group focused on meticulously searching every square meter around the wooden fence, identified as the last location where Grace may have stood before the trail went cold. To ensure no traces were missed, the search team used survey poles to part the tall grass on both sides, looking for any depressions, slide marks, or foreign objects beneath the layer of decaying leaves. Areas that could have been disturbed by spontaneous searches by locals in the initial hours were separately cordoned off to assess the degree of impact and avoid confusing natural marks with evidence related to the case. As they moved farther from the fence by several dozen meters, the search team came across a small paper bag lying at the edge of a drainage ditch, about half a meter from the road surface. The bag was slightly damp at the bottom due to moisture rising from the ditch, but the opening remained intact, with no tears or folded edges. The investigation team immediately sealed off the surrounding area to prevent disturbing the scene. It could not yet be determined whether the bag belonged to Grace, but its location matched the direction of Grace's movement based on initial witness statements and lay within the zone where the perpetrator may have stopped the vehicle. The bag was marked, photographed at the scene, and its exact position recorded for transfer to the evidence analysis unit. The discovery of the paper bag was the first physical clue to emerge since the start of the case, helping to more clearly define the range the victim may have passed through in her final moments before disappearing. In addition to this evidence, the investigation team noted several faint tire impressions on the soft ground in the area bordering the main road and the open space near the fence. The impressions had uneven depths due to greater compression in some sections, suggesting the vehicle may have braked abruptly or changed direction right at that spot. The tread pattern indicated they belonged to a light-duty truck with dimensions consistent with models produced before the 1970s. This characteristic matched the initial witness description of a brown Ford F-100 that had been seen around the neighborhood. To ensure accurate analysis, the technical team measured the width between the tread marks, the depth of compression, and the direction of soil deformation at contact points. Some impressions were interrupted by fallen dry leaves covering them, but through overall comparison, the investigation team was still able to determine the direction the tires left the area, heading south. These marks indicated the vehicle had stopped long enough to exert pressure on the ground before accelerating in an open escape direction out of the residential area. Although the tire marks were not sufficient to trace a license plate or precisely identify the vehicle, their existence confirmed the fence area as the site of the final contact between Grace and the suspect vehicle. The search extended to both sides of the road to assess the possibility that the victim moved further after leaving the line of sight. However, no traces such as footprints or other samples appeared beyond the blind spot and ditch area, reinforcing the hypothesis that Grace had no opportunity to run or walk far and was taken directly into the vehicle right there. The terrain survey team created a detailed map of the entire swamp and nearby canal area to rule out scenarios where the victim moved off the route or was taken to hard-to-reach zones. The map clearly showed the three main water channels, average depths, and flow directions, helping determine the likelihood of evidence drifting or being discarded. The deputies noted that the paper bag's position on the ditch edge, without being swept away, indicated it had not been there long, and may have been dropped within the time frame matching the disappearance. Evaluating all data collected from the scene, the investigation team concluded that the approach occurred in the blind spot area. The vehicle stopped at the location with tire marks. The victim most likely interacted directly with the driver for a very short time, and the paper bag was the only remaining peripheral evidence before the perpetrator left the area heading south toward town. The expanded scene search helped solidify the investigation focus on a motor vehicle while ruling out scenarios where the victim voluntarily went far from the disappearance site. The tire marks collected around the blind spot area became the basis for the investigation team to shift focus to tracking the vehicle, especially since multiple witnesses had mentioned a brown Ford F-100 repeatedly seen around the neighborhood before Grace vanished. The investigation team compiled all resident descriptions: faded brown paint, low bed profile characteristic of the F-Series, heavy and uneven engine noise, a long scratch on the left side, and unusually slow movement when passing the Murphy house. Some witnesses also reported the truck often parked briefly at two fixed spots near the street intersection and next to the abandoned house, positions offering clear views toward Grace's walking route. These descriptions were cross-referenced with physical characteristics from the tread marks on the soft ground, confirming tire size and axle width consistent with light-duty trucks from the 1960s, 70s, thereby eliminating newer truck models or larger commercial vehicles. The investigation team proceeded to pull vehicle registration data in Terrebonne Parish and applied filters including year of manufacture, vehicle type, similar paint color, exterior repair history, and owners residing within a few miles of the scene. The initial list was quite large, but after excluding vehicles owned by businesses or those recorded as in garages during the relevant period, only personally owned vehicles likely to move freely in the area remained. The deputies further narrowed by residence location, reasonable travel distance, and the likelihood of the driver being in the neighborhood on the morning Grace went missing. Through this cross-checking process, the list was reduced to 27 potential vehicles, all older F-Series models with color and body condition, relatively matching witness descriptions. Each owner received a summary profile including address, occupation, most recent vehicle use, potential alibi confirmers, and any legal status data. One name gradually stood out during the review: Harold Boudreau, residing on the northern edge of Houma. Registration records showed Harold owned an F-100 purchased from an acquaintance in the same year as the disappearance, and the truck had been repaired after a minor sideswipe on the left side. This detail matched the scratch described by witnesses. Harold's occupation was also flagged as involving freelance mobile work, frequently passing routes near the Murphy home for small repair jobs. His irregular schedule made verifying his alibi more difficult than for most other owners. The investigation team evaluated all data related to Harold and noted that some neighbors had seen him in distant residential areas without clear reason. This information was not enough to conclude unusual behavior, but was included in the file as fitting the profile of someone with free movement habits, easily blending into communities, and leaving little schedule trace. When cross-referencing routes Harold likely used on workdays, many overlapped with areas where witnesses saw the suspect truck moving slowly, especially near the intersection leading to the Murphy home. The investigation team accordingly prioritized Harold's file for early verification among the 27 potential owners. The list was finalized and organized into a risk-ranked table based on the degree of match between witness descriptions, vehicle characteristics, and each owner's movement patterns. This screening step provided the foundation for moving to the alibi verification and actual vehicle inspection phase, further narrowing the group potentially directly involved in Grace's disappearance. Narrowing the suspect truck and the list of 27 owners only addressed half the initial investigation requirements, while the more urgent priority remained locating Grace while she might still be found in the vicinity. Command expanded the search beyond the residential area, deploying ground teams along red dirt roads leading to the southern swamps and dispatching motorized boats to patrol small canal branches connecting to deeper water. These areas featured complex terrain, extensive mudflats, dense reeds, murky water, variable flow with tides, and places rarely visited by locals. Ground teams split into groups of 3 to 4, searching in a comb pattern, marking checkpoints to avoid overlaps. Deputies were equipped with probing poles to check sinkholes, shallow pools, and mudflats that could conceal objects. On the water side, patrol boats scanned canal segments, using drag nets for unusual floating objects, and logging vortex points, or large reed clusters obstructing visibility. Due to the vast swamp and numerous branches, the investigation team created a temporary map with sequentially marked checkpoints to ensure all potentially relevant directions were covered. During the search, a hypothesis emerged based on terrain features and the paper bag's position. The victim may have been taken to water or accidentally fallen from the vehicle and slid into a ditch, leading to the swamp. This hypothesis stemmed from the blind spot's proximity to a drainage ditch and the tire marks heading south toward swamp access roads. The idea quickly gained support from some search team members as the terrain suggested the perpetrator could exploit water to conceal traces. As the operation expanded, most resources were redirected to canals, swamps, and low-water areas to check for the victim being left or meeting harm there. Small outboard boats, canoes, and local wooden skiffs were mobilized to reach areas inaccessible by land. Deputies used grappling hooks to probe deeper sections and scanned every meter for signs related to Grace. Shifting search focus to water earlier than planned significantly altered resource allocation. Ground search teams were scaled back, leaving secondary roads, abandoned houses, and rarely visited areas inadequately covered. This reduced the chance of finding direct clues related to the vehicle or perpetrator, which might have left ground traces during approach or departure. Some deputies expressed concern that overemphasizing water could derail the investigation, as no direct evidence indicated victim contact with the swamp. However, the expansion decision was maintained to avoid missing the possibility Grace met harm near the scene. Water search coverage extended several more square kilometers, including main swamp canals and side branches. Teams used stakes to mark checked areas and reported unusual objects found, mostly drifting trash, branches and unrelated items. A terrain support group identified high reed density spots requiring boats to stop for manual checks. While the search continued, the investigation team noted very few actual clues from water areas, with no signs the victim had been there. These results diminished the hypothesis of Grace being taken to or falling into the swamp, while tire marks and the bag position still pointed to direct victim vehicle contact on land. Although not fully ruling out water involvement, Command noted that unbalanced allocation between ground and water searches reduced effectiveness in finding key physical clues potentially on trails, clearings, or side areas linking residential zones to main roads. The wide-scale operation helped eliminate some initial scenarios, but consumed significant time and resources, forcing the investigation team to reassess strategy to avoid further prolonging misdirection in pursuing the perpetrator. The expanded search campaign had not yet yielded results when the Sheriff's Office Coordination Center began receiving numerous reports of sightings of a girl resembling Grace in nearby towns such as Gibson, Gray, and Chauvin. These sightings came from passers-by, convenience store employees, or truck drivers, each providing differing descriptions of the encounter. Some reports claimed the girl was seen with a middle-aged man, while others said she was alone or sitting near the window of a vehicle with an unknown license plate. The investigation team assigned units to verify each tip in the order received, starting with the areas closest to Houma. When the search team approached Gibson and checked the area where a witness claimed to have seen a girl standing in front of a gas station, the surveillance cameras captured no matching footage, and store employees denied the information. Another tip from Gray described a girl in bright-colored clothing getting into a pickup truck, but the statements were inconsistent regarding the truck's color, the number of occupants, or the direction of travel. In Chauvin, a report stated that a girl who looked scared was with a man wearing a baseball cap, but none of the people present in that area remembered seeing anything similar. Most sightings could not be verified or contradicted the time frame in which Grace could have left the blind spot area in the described direction. The investigation team observed that the farther from the town center, the lower the accuracy of the statements, with many reports stemming more from community anxiety than reliable information. During the re-interviewing of witnesses in the original crime scene area, the statement from the girl living near the Murphy home, who had said she thought she saw Grace standing near a brown vehicle, was thoroughly re-examined. When asked for more details, the child could not clearly determine the distance, timing, or exact position of Grace. Many details changed from the initial account. The investigation team prepared a report noting the level of information distortion due to the witness's young age, limited observational ability, and influence from adult conversations during the spontaneous search. Relying too heavily on descriptions from young witnesses risked misdirecting the strategy, as children's memories are easily influenced by surrounding context. At the same time, anonymous tips began appearing via phone calls to the sheriff's office. Some calls claimed Grace had been taken by boat toward Grand Isle, while others said the victim was being held in a cabin in the woods near the Bayou Black Swamp. Most calls lacked specific details or provided information inconsistent with evidence collected at the scene. Nevertheless, the investigation team still had to classify and evaluate each tip to ensure no potentially valuable lead was overlooked. Tips with questionable origins came from curious crowds or callers intending to create interference, forcing the intake unit to create a categorization table based on credibility level and compatibility with physical evidence. Processing these sources consumed time and slowed the review of genuine leads. The sudden surge in false information led the investigation team to recognize that the operation was at risk of data overload, as tips poured in from multiple locations simultaneously, but most held no investigative value. In reality, each false tip dispersed resources for verification, reducing manpower available for analyzing physical evidence, checking feasible routes, and screening suspects. Additionally, information noise obscured the logical connections between the tire tracks, paper bag and blind spot scene, key clues that were opening a focused investigative direction. The community spreading unverified stories also placed considerable pressure on the sheriff's office, forcing the investigation team to release limited information to prevent excessive public interference with the investigative strategy. Summarizing all data from false sightings, vague testimonies, and anonymous tips, the investigation team concluded that new details only held value when cross-referenced with the physical scene, and that allowing noise to guide the process would weaken the ability to determine the perpetrator's direction of travel during the critical early phase. Identifying and eliminating noise became a crucial factor in helping the investigation team maintain focus on leads grounded in reality in the search for Grace. The flood of false leads not only slowed progress but also drew intense attention from local media, leading to widespread coverage of Grace's disappearance. Newspapers in Houma, Thibodaux, and New Orleans all ran the story prominently, heightening community anxiety and pressing authorities to quickly announce developments. Local radio stations repeatedly broadcast calls for information, causing the volume of tips to spike but with uneven quality. The media began speculating on causes and the victim's direction of travel, even recreating unverified scenarios. These analyses inadvertently steered public opinion toward certain biased theories, creating pressure that forced the investigation team to respond to or verify information not originating from the case file. Amid rising public expectations, the sheriff's office was compelled to release some search updates to reassure the community, thereby creating invisible pressure on investigative decisions. Certain lines of inquiry began to be prioritized based on public interest rather than compatibility with physical evidence. For example, the theory that the victim was taken into the swamp was pursued more aggressively than necessary because it aligned with stories circulating in the press, even though scene evidence did not directly support that direction. Resource allocation thus became skewed, reducing time spent screening roadways where the perpetrator was more likely to have left significant traces. While search teams focused heavily on water areas, the cross-verification of suspect and witness statements was not conducted thoroughly. Many witnesses provided overlapping or evolving details over time, but were not re-documented in a way that allowed accurate comparison. Some suspects among the 27 vehicle owners provided verbal alibis without supporting documentation, leading to certain cases being removed from consideration earlier than reasonable. The cross-checking process, essential for eliminating errors in investigation, was not fully applied because resources were spread across multiple search fronts. Gathering additional information on vehicle owners was also limited, as some records were processed hastily, without clear notes on the degree of match between witness descriptions and vehicle condition. Within this group, the biggest issue was the failure to fully verify Harold Boudreau's alibi. He was only briefly interviewed about his morning schedule and gave a vague response that he was working out in the swamp without any corroborating witnesses. The investigation team recorded the statement but did not conduct independent verification through individuals who could confirm his location or cross-reference local data, such as records of supply purchases, fuel transactions, or routine boat repair schedules. Harold's file was marked unclear but not elevated in priority, mainly because time and manpower were being directed toward peripheral search activities. This inadvertently placed him in the category of suspects showing signs warranting review but not closely monitored, causing his file to sink deeper into the list rather than being immediately screened when tire tracks and witness descriptions matched his own vehicle. The investigation team also did not request an actual inspection of Harold's F-100 in the early days, because there was no procedure at the time requiring owners to bring vehicles in for trace comparison. This created a procedural gap where authorities missed the opportunity to document the vehicle's actual condition closest to the time of the disappearance, a highly valuable data point if new scratches, impact marks, or unusual changes were present on the body. In that context, ongoing public input continued to exert pressure, forcing command to hold multiple short press conferences to demonstrate that search efforts were still underway. Having to continually update with non-breakthrough results stretched the overall investigative strategy toward reacting to public expectations rather than relying solely on key leads. As statements from witnesses, suspects, and sighting reports accumulated without sequential cross-verification, data analysis became chaotic and lacked logical anchors. Each false or insufficient tip diluted the file, making it harder to identify the actual vehicle or perpetrator using the initial traces. These errors placed the early investigation phase in a state of inefficiency, creating conditions for a potential suspect to continue moving or altering behavior without timely detection. Media pressure gradually subsided, but the lack of progress caused the investigation to stall, and the initial scene traces did not open any new direction strong enough to sustain active investigation. For many months, the investigation team continued screening routes, re-interviewing witnesses, checking additional old truck owners, and expanding the search for physical evidence, but no details were added to the still thin chain of information. The original tire tracks faded due to weather, the paper bag yielded no identifiable biological traces, and witness statements either repeated or changed over time without creating a breakthrough. The list of 27 vehicle owners, including Harold Boudreau, remained in the file but without additional direct evidence to raise anyone's priority level. When patrol teams completed final sweeps of peripheral areas and confirmed no new signs were found, the sheriff's office had to acknowledge that investigative efforts had reached saturation. Maintaining a large workforce for a case without leads became impractical given the parish's limited resources, which had to be shared with other cases. Grace's disappearance file was re-evaluated under state criteria and classified as no feasible progress. Command decided to end active investigation and transfer the case to the Louisiana State Police Cold Case Unit for long-term storage and monitoring. This was a common step for cases extending beyond a year without new leads, especially in the 1970s when trace analysis technology was limited and federal data was not yet interconnected. Upon receiving the file, the Cold Case Unit compiled all physical evidence collected from the scene, the paper bag, tire track photographs, route diagrams, terrain analysis reports, swamp maps, and records related to locations where the suspect vehicle had appeared. Everything was stored in a large file as sealed physical evidence or handwritten documents with minimal typed copies, per storage standards of the era. Alongside the physical evidence, the unit compiled statements from witnesses, sighting providers, interviewed vehicle owners, and notes from anonymous calls. Although the volume of information was large, most data lacked determinative value due to absence of corroborating proof or inability to accurately recreate over time. The Cold Case Unit's evaluation report also noted that discrepancies in initial statements, particularly from young witnesses and some residents influenced by media, significantly reduced data reliability. Recompiling statements and evidence revealed the case structure was fragmented into disconnected branches without strong intersection points leading to a specific suspect. Once the transfer was complete, Grace's file officially entered the information freeze phase. Documents were archived in state storage, to be reviewed only upon new leads or investigator request. At the sheriff's office, the emergence of other cases forced resource reallocation, and Grace's disappearance gradually moved down the priority list. The Houma community retained memories of the little girl's vanishing, but procedurally, No further active steps were taken due to lack of new data to exploit. From that point, Grace Murphy's file existed as silent evidence, an owner unknown paper bag, tire tracks no longer comparable, an unupdated suspect list, and a series of unverifiable statements. The initial investigation phase ended in complete stagnation, and the case was placed among the state's unsolved files, where it remained dormant for many years without any new signals emerging. While the investigation in Houma gradually stalled into a deadlock, developments involving Grace continued in a direction completely separate from the authorities' search efforts. After disappearing from her familiar route, Grace was taken by Harold to a small cabin deep in the forested swamp area near the boundary between Terrebonne Parish and Assumption Parish. The cabin was built from old wood, had no official registered address, and was miles away from the nearest major road across muddy terrain, accessible only by a narrow, unused trail. The dense vegetation and natural water channels surrounding it made the cabin almost completely isolated from any human activity. Grace was brought into the cabin in a state of disorientation due to the constant changes between muddy paths and light blocked by thick tree canopy. The interior space was simple: an old bed, a small table, rough wooden shelves, and the only light source coming from a narrow window without curtains. Harold placed Grace in one corner of the room, and initially kept his distance, but maintained strict surveillance to prevent any escape attempts. In the early days, Harold limited communication, only providing simple food and water, while locking the cabin door both when inside and when leaving. Grace was not allowed outside, and Harold frequently checked the windows whenever he heard any noise, preventing Grace from reaching gaps that could make sounds to attract others. Control was maintained through high-frequency monitoring, and keeping the cabin always sealed, making any attention-drawing action by Grace immediately detectable. The cabin was so far from populated areas that the only sounds Grace could hear were insects, water flowing in the surrounding channels, and occasionally the faint engine noise from fishing boats out in the swamp. This level of isolation completely deprived Grace of the ability to determine her geographical location, making any theoretical escape route practically impossible. Additionally, the cabin had only one access direction, crossing soft ground that easily left footprints, and was frequently monitored by Harold. Any attempt to leave the cabin without thorough preparation would result in immediate detection by Harold. In the first weeks, Harold maintained the habit of leaving the cabin early in the morning to perform machinery repairs in the swamp area, but always locked the door from the outside before going. When at the cabin, Harold always stayed within range to observe Grace and had the habit of placing small objects on shelves or near the door to check if Grace had tried to move anything. Any minor change in arrangement was noted by Harold, demonstrating high vigilance and ability to anticipate Grace's behavior. Food supplies mainly consisted of canned goods and dry bread, brought by Harold upon returning. The cabin had a small gas stove, but Harold did not allow Grace to use it to avoid the risk of fire or creating odors that could lead to detection. Clean water was stored in plastic containers and replenished when Harold passed points with potable sources. There was no electricity, no means of communication, and the only window was positioned too high for Grace to clearly see outside. Escape opportunities were further limited because Harold always locked the cabin door when leaving, and often returned unexpectedly at varying times of the day, making it impossible for Grace to predict a safe window for action. Moreover, the swamp forest environment outside the cabin was extremely difficult to navigate. Sinking ground, dense reeds, and the presence of wildlife meant that fleeing without knowing the way would lead to the risk of getting stuck or injured. The living conditions confined in a closed space with an unstable schedule and strict surveillance created a phase of controlled captivity that Grace could not break. Throughout the first 2 years, the cabin served as the central detention site, isolating Grace from any chance of social contact or locating her position, laying the foundation for a long series of years living under complete control. The cabin in the swamp forest served as the initial detention point, but Harold did not maintain this location for too long. Concerns that the cabin might be discovered or accidentally fall within local authorities' patrol range led him to gradually change strategy. About 2 years after Grace was brought to the cabin, Harold began moving between various areas to reduce the risk of leaving fixed traces. The first destination after the cabin was the area near Morgan City, where there were many old warehouses and temporary structures used by fishermen or machinery repair workers. There Harold rented an old inactive boathouse, utilizing the space to create a temporary hideout. The warehouse saw little traffic because it was on the edge of the dock, and only drew attention during peak fishing seasons, allowing Harold to bring Grace there without attracting notice. The time in Morgan City allowed Harold more frequent interaction with the Riverside labor community, enabling him to blend into the crowded environment without being overly recognized. However, he never registered official residence, never updated addresses, and avoided any activities that would leave public records. This meant his presence in the area was completely unrecorded in the population management systems of that era. When the Morgan City area began becoming more crowded due to the expansion of the oil and gas industry, Harold decided to move on to Pierre Part, a small community in the swamp forest with scattered population structure and very low surveillance potential. There he rented or borrowed temporary houses from acquaintances for short periods, explaining his irregular comings and goings with verbal contract repair work. By frequently changing residences, Harold avoided creating a fixed residency pattern, a factor that could have placed him on screening lists if authorities expanded investigations along travel routes or property records. During his time in Pierre Part, Harold used unofficial identities with strangers, only using his real name when absolutely necessary with old acquaintances in a limited circle. He also utilized old documents from deceased relatives or expired identification papers to create a legal facade for minor transactions, such as buying parts, fuel, or repair materials. Falsifying identity in the late 1970s and early 1980s was much easier than in later periods, because identity verification systems were fragmented, with no automated cross-checking mechanisms between parishes or states. This advantage allowed Harold to completely conceal Grace's existence from any administrative data sweeps. The final location in this movement chain was Lafayette, where Harold stayed the longest. The outskirts of Lafayette had many mobile home areas and low-income neighborhoods, creating an ideal environment for someone without registered residence to blend in unnoticed. Shifting to a more populated living environment helped Harold mix into the freelance labor community, where personal identities were rarely thoroughly checked. During this time, Grace continued to live under strict control, rarely leaving the house, and never appearing in front of Harold's acquaintances. The mobile homes were clustered, but separate, allowing Harold to control entrances and exits, and limit any social contact opportunities for Grace. One of the key reasons Harold evaded the investigation systems of that time was the lack of interconnection between parish and state-level databases. When Grace's file was transferred to the cold case unit, data related to potential suspects, including Harold, was not automatically updated from other systems. Harold's lack of registered residence at any address for nearly a decade meant law enforcement agencies could not identify his presence in these areas, even with patrols, because Harold did not violate local laws and did not draw attention through violent or disruptive behavior. At that stage, identity checks primarily relied on personal documents and direct statements. Harold exploited this weakness by only appearing in transactions that did not require verification, such as cash purchases or informal contract work. The lack of connection between vehicle registration systems, tax data, and travel records further made tracing Harold nearly impossible without direct leads pointing to him. Through his ability to choose scattered living environments, continuously change areas, and exploit the looseness of the population management systems of that era, Harold maintained years without leaving any administrative traces that could link him to the Houma disappearance for investigators. In the 1977-1985 period, Harold's movement chain created an effective evasion loop, keeping Grace's case completely detached from all efforts to locate the victim. The continuous movements by Harold over many years meant Grace's disappearance had no additional signs to trigger a renewed investigation, until a young investigator from the sheriff's office took interest in the old file in the early 1980s. While reviewing missing children cases in Terrebonne Parish, he noticed Grace's case because the timing, location, and nature of the incident all bore signs of intentional conduct, differing from common cases of children getting lost or running away. The investigator proposed re-examining the entire file, including physical evidence, statements, and the initial suspect list. In the process, he focused on reconstructing the timelines of the 27 F-100 owners who had been screened in the early phase, to assess who might have been active in the Houma area on the morning Grace disappeared. The timelines were built from limited data, a few details from interview records, stored vehicle files, and reports from deputies who participated in the initial investigation. Some suspects were re-cleared because they had clear alibis, confirmed by multiple independent sources. However, most other cases lacked sufficient data to verify or rule out, especially freelance workers without time clock records or interactions with administrative agencies. Harold Boudreau fell into this group. The file only noted his statement that he was working near the swamp that morning, but there were no witnesses to confirm it, and no reliable documents recording his location. The investigator noted this as a point needing verification, but finding people who could confirm the information proved impossible, because many who once lived near Harold had moved away or no longer remembered details from the late 1970s. Efforts to extend the timeline into the years after the disappearance also yielded no significant information. Harold's frequent residence changes, lack of address registration, and avoidance of official transactions meant no administrative data recorded his presence. On paper, Harold had essentially vanished from Terrebonne Parish shortly after the case occurred. This made it impossible to cross-reference travel frequency, residency history, or social connections, key factors in determining whether a suspect maintained the capability to commit the crime. The absence of statewide databases in that era was one of the biggest barriers. Residency, vehicle registration, and criminal record databases across parishes were not interconnected. Any cross-check requests had to be done manually and relied on individual agency files. If someone like Harold moved from Terrebonne to Assumption or Iberia without registering an address, the administrative system had no automatic mechanism to detect the change. All queries about identity or vehicles had to be sent by mail or phone, which were prone to delays and incomplete information. Retrieving records of old vehicle sales was also infeasible, because many F-100s from that time were transferred through verbal deals, without updates to registration systems. The investigator also re-examined physical evidence, but the paper bag yielded no usable fingerprints, and tire tracks existed only as photographs, impossible to accurately match against vehicles nearly a decade later. Witnesses who once lived near the Murphy home were re-interviewed, but most could not clearly recall details from 1975, and vague statements did not meet the standard for expanding the investigation. Some older witnesses even expressed that descriptions circulated in the media at the time may have mixed with actual memories, rendering their information unreliable for verification. When reviewing the suspect list, the investigator tried to recontact some of the 27 vehicle owners, but the process faced many obstacles. A few had moved to other states, some had sold or scrapped their vehicles, and the rest did not accurately remember the vehicle's condition at the time of the incident. Among them, Harold was no longer at his old address, and the places he had lived had no records indicating when or where he moved. There was no direct evidence linking Harold, or anyone on the list, to the scene beyond owning a vehicle model matching witness descriptions. The lack of matches between physical evidence and residency data caused all cross-checking efforts to reach a deadlock. After months of review without finding new information, the investigator had to conclude that the re-investigation lacked sufficient grounds to reopen the case. Grace's file continued to be kept in storage, and although noted by a few individuals in the field, the case still lacked new elements to surpass the cold case threshold under procedural standards of that time. After many years of moving through scattered locations, Harold settled more stably in the peripheral areas of Lafayette, where there were numerous mobile home parks, fluctuating resident communities, and low levels of administrative oversight. During this period, Grace had entered her teenage years, and Harold began using a new identity for her Anna. This name was applied by Harold in any situation that might involve contact with strangers, though instances of Grace being seen by others were extremely rare. Creating an alternate identity allowed Harold to proactively erase any connection between Grace and the disappearance in Houma, while minimizing risks if authorities happened to make contact or ask questions. Grace, under the identity Anna, existed only within the confines of a mobile home or the temporary spaces where Harold resided, with absolutely no access to the community. Throughout this time, Harold controlled all of Grace's basic activities, including sleep schedules, eating times, household chores, and even minor behaviors like opening curtains or standing near doors. The mobile home was typically positioned far from the center of residential areas, and Harold always chose locations with high tenant turnover, where neighbors changed so frequently that no one noticed the appearance or disappearance of an individual. Grace was almost never allowed to leave the home, except when Harold required help moving items or tending to the interior living space. The tasks Grace performed were primarily internal: cleaning, simple cooking on a small gas stove, washing and hanging laundry, organizing repair tools, and preparing items. Harold took to work. These activities gradually formed a closed, repetitive routine that offered no opportunities for relationships or social contact. Complete dependence on Harold became the central factor in Grace's life, as all sources of food, water, medical care, and daily necessities were controlled by him. The prolonged lack of social contact led to significant changes in Grace's behavior and responses. In the early years after being taken from Houma, Grace had attempted to explore her surroundings and observe external signals from the cabin or warehouse. However, from the mid-1980s onward, Grace rarely displayed acts of resistance or attempts to escape. This change did not stem from voluntary acceptance, but was a consequence of prolonged isolation and the absence of reference points to distinguish safe from dangerous boundaries. Harold's strict control over every behavior, combined with the complete lack of external support, caused Grace to gradually narrow her needs and adapt to the framework Harold imposed. Grace's maturation occurred without any formal education. With no opportunity to attend school, read books, or access information, she grew up without the full knowledge base of a typical person. What Harold permitted determined her entire understanding of the outside world. This limited Grace's social responses, from communication skills to handling unfamiliar situations. As she entered young adulthood, Grace became quieter and more cautious, avoiding noise or actions that Harold might view as exceeding allowed boundaries. Even in the restricted spaces where Grace could move, her behavior was always tied to an awareness of being monitored. When Harold went to work, he often returned unexpectedly to check. When he slept, he placed random objects at doors, on tables or along pathways to detect if Grace had moved them. This led Grace to develop the habit of leaving everything exactly as it was, avoiding any behavior that might draw attention. The relationship between Harold and Grace during this phase was one of unilateral dependence. Harold demanded, Grace complied. There was no opportunity for equal exchange or expressing opinions. Toward the late 1980s, dependence became the only living condition Grace knew. Years passing within that framework gradually diminished Grace's ability to independently assess situations or seize escape opportunities. The environmental characteristics, remote mobile homes, cramped spaces, constant changes in residence, created a control loop that left any escape plan without a feasible starting point. Over nearly a decade, Grace's true identity completely vanished from all social systems, and Anna was the only name Harold maintained in their rare interactions. The 1985-1990s period marked Grace's maturation in an absolutely confined environment that allowed no independent development or access to the outside world, locking her increasingly into the sole reality Harold created. While Grace's life was locked within the isolated spaces Harold controlled, the Murphy family continued their search for their daughter over many years with repeated efforts that rarely yielded results. Soon after the official investigation stalled, the family proactively contacted private search groups, hired volunteer organizations, and even paid locals familiar with the swamp areas to scan regions beyond what police had covered. Elizabeth posted missing person notices in all local newspapers, large and small, from the Houma Courier to publications in Thibodaux, Morgan City, and Baton Rouge. Once a year, she resubmitted Grace's photo at age 11 for republishing, hoping someone might recognize the girl or notice something the police had missed. Daniel, growing up in the shadow of his sister's absence, became his mother's partner in tracking new leads. The two maintained the habit of checking every reported sighting in newspapers or by phone, even vague ones. They contacted local TV stations like WWL and KATC, requesting mentions of the case on programs about missing children or community safety. Grace's information sometimes aired, sometimes rejected for lack of updates, but the family kept sending letters and photos whenever possible. Contacting TV stations served not only the search, but also to keep Grace's existence alive in community memory, as Elizabeth believed the worst outcome was not failing to find her daughter, but letting time erase the fact that she had ever existed. In the early years after the disappearance, Michael, Grace's father, actively joined the search, spending time in nearby towns or following promising tips. But repeated disappointments led to mental exhaustion. His job requiring long absences on offshore rigs prevented him from sustaining efforts like Elizabeth and Daniel. In the late 1980s, Michael gradually broke down, and his health visibly declined. He died from cardiovascular complications, carrying the regret of never bringing Grace home. Michael's death further burdened Daniel, who had by then reached adulthood. Daniel faced growing up under the weight of the disappearance, an experience that left him feeling he needed to do more to make up for his helplessness. That morning, in 1975, he continued maintaining contacts with past search participants, recording names and numbers of anyone providing information, even unfounded leads. When the internet reached Louisiana in the early 1990s, Daniel tried posting about Grace on early forums, though reach was very limited then. Elizabeth, despite loss and passing time, kept one routine once a year. She visited the sheriff's office to update Grace's missing person file, reminding the system the case remained unresolved. This was not required by procedure, but she did it to preserve the file's existence. At the office, she refilled forms, updated contact info, and sometimes asked about new leads. The answer was almost always no, but she returned annually. This kept Grace's file from being completely forgotten among cold case documents, though not enough to restart investigation. The corner of the home where Grace once slept was kept nearly unchanged by Elizabeth for almost 2 decades. Daniel occasionally fixed frames or replaced small items, but the room largely remained as it was the morning Grace left. For the family, this was not just preserving memory, but the only remaining reminder that Grace had not spiritually vanished from their lives. Over 25 years, the Murphy family's search efforts varied in intensity by period, but never fully stopped. Any tip, however small, was examined. Any media invitation, even brief, was accepted. This persistence kept Grace's disappearance from fading into oblivion, though lack of leads left the family with almost no tools to break the prolonged waiting. In the 1985-1990s period, Grace's life was confined to isolated spaces under Harold's control, while the Murphy family clung to fragile hope that someday someone would recognize her and bring information back. A hope that persisted but remained unanswered. The Murphy family's persistence over nearly 2 decades yielded no breakthrough, but the landscape of criminal investigation in the United States began changing in the late 1990s as federal agencies pushed to build and standardize nationwide DNA analysis systems. The emergence of the National Missing Persons DNA Program marked a key milestone in handling long-term missing persons cases, allowing collection and comparison of relatives' DNA samples with unidentified samples or remaining evidence in files. The program also supported standardizing biometric data storage, enabling cold cases to be re-examined using modern technology. Upon learning of the program through Sheriff's Office notices and missing persons support organizations, Elizabeth and Daniel immediately registered and provided required DNA samples. Submission included 2 parts, Elizabeth's buccal swab, as direct reference, and Daniel's to supplement familial genetic information for higher matching success. The DNA data was sent to the designated state lab, and then to the federal system. For Grace's case, joining the DNA program not only offered future matching potential, but also flagged her file for priority comparison when new data emerged. In the Louisiana Cold Case Unit's evidence storage, the paper bag collected in 1975 remained preserved under standard conditions. Though time caused degradation, late 1990s DNA analysis advances allowed specialists to attempt extracting remaining biological traces, including skin cells or DNA molecules on the paper surface or bag opening. Results showed extremely faint DNA quantities, insufficient for a full profile, but the lab still recorded usable fragmented segments as supplemental data. These were marked partial profile, insufficient for direct identification, but usable for future significant matches with reference or suspect samples. Having even a low-quality partial profile elevated Grace's case above many contemporaneous disappearances, lacking analyzable evidence. The Murphy family samples and partial profile from the bag were entered into CODIS Combined DNA Index System and NCIC, National Crime Information Center, federal databases holding millions of records, including missing persons, unidentified victims, and samples from convicted or detained individuals. CODIS was especially vital for automatic comparisons between family samples and any law enforcement submitted DNA nationwide. Meanwhile, NCIC stored non-biological details like physical descriptions, personal characteristics, and supplemental investigation data, linking previously manual unconnectable records. Entering DNA data federally yielded no immediate results, but it marked the first time in over 20 years that Grace's disappearance was no longer confined to local or state scope. Each new DNA submission to CODIS nationwide triggered automatic checks for matches with the Murphy family samples or bag fragments. This created a wholly different search opportunity from earlier reliance on witnesses or scattered tips. For the Murphy family, federal DNA entry was the only technical advance in 2 decades. Daniel tracked program progress via state public reports, noting that more participating agencies increased matching odds. Though aware immediate results were unlikely, the family saw it as the first real chance to break the 1975 deadlock. DNA storage also reinforced the case's cold case status, ensuring any new data would be re-compared with Grace's file. Though initial comparisons yielded no matches, the DNA presence in CODIS and NCIC transformed the case foundation for the first time in years. The file was no longer dormant in storage, but integrated into national data flow, where technological advances could unlock previously impossible connections. The entry of the Murphy family's DNA profiles into the federal system occurred during the same period when Harold began experiencing serious health issues after years of heavy labor and living in conditions with little access to medical care. During one prolonged chest pain episode in the Lafayette area, Harold was forced to go to the local hospital for examination, marking the first time in many years that he had to interact with an official paperwork system. When asked to provide personal information for admission procedures, Harold gave a name and date of birth that did not match any residency records in the hospital's database. The administrative staff discovered that the information he provided lacked a social security number, lacked a verifiable address, and had no valid identification documents. Although cases of missing documentation were not uncommon in the freelance labor community, the inconsistency between his statements and the system data forced the hospital to note the anomaly in the record. Grace, who by then had been living under the identity Anna for many years, accompanied Harold to assist with simple tasks like signing forms or retrieving personal items for him, but she too could not provide any identification. This further raised suspicions among hospital staff, as neither could prove their relationship or basic information, nor could it be verified through any state data channels. Under standard procedures in the late 1990s, all inpatient patients were required to provide blood samples for testing. Harold's blood sample was stored in the federal health system through a newly implemented automation mechanism, which allowed laboratories to use encoded biological data for research and medical cross-referencing. Grace was also required to provide a blood sample due to her frequent presence in the room and being recorded as the accompanying caregiver, despite having no clear legal relationship. The fact that both Harold and Grace lacked documentation led the hospital to apply temporary patient codes, noting the records as unverified ID. Some medical staff began questioning the relationship between the two when they noticed Grace avoiding communication, not proactively answering questions, and only repeating the information Harold had provided. During times when Harold left the room for tests, Grace often sat quietly in the corner rather than leaving the area, behavior that gave the impression of dependence rather than a normal family relationship. One point that caught the attention of administrative staff was Harold's claim that Grace was his cousin, yet he could not provide information about any other family members beyond vague names and an address that did not exist when cross-checked with Lafayette maps. When pressed further, Harold became irritated, evasive, and requested that no one outside be contacted. This situation led to the record being reported to the Patient Management Department for review of potential document fraud or false identity. At the same time, the blood samples from Harold and Grace were sent to the laboratory under routine procedures and entered into the Federal Biological Data System. This was not an investigative action, but part of the hospital's process to ensure medical records were interconnected across facilities. However, the federal system had an automatic matching mechanism between newly entered biological data and flagged records in missing persons cases, allowing algorithms to detect potential matches without direct human intervention. As Harold's temporary medical record was transferred from administration to internal coordination, some treating physicians noted a discrepancy between his health condition and the age he reported. Medical parameters indicated that Harold was likely older than the age he provided. This was not enough to confirm false identity, but further fueled the medical team's suspicion that both Harold and Grace were not providing accurate information. One nurse reported that Grace, under the name Anna, could not read basic medical documents, could not complete simple forms, and was unfamiliar with many common items. These did not align with the biological maturity age she displayed, leading hospital staff to note abnormal behavior in the record. These suspicions were not sufficient to trigger a legal report, but were enough to mark both individuals' records as requiring further verification and special monitoring. While the hospital procedures continued normally with Harold's treatment, the biological data from his and Grace's blood samples had begun moving into the federal system, unexpectedly creating conditions for cross-referencing with encoded missing persons records, including Grace Murphy's profile, which had been updated with family DNA shortly before. The biological data generated from Harold and Grace's blood samples at the Lafayette Hospital quickly entered the Federal Laboratory Network's automated analysis system, and this very matching mechanism created the breakthrough the case had lacked for over 2 decades. When Harold's DNA was encoded and compared against open profiles in CODIS, the system recorded a partial match with the very weak DNA profile obtained from the paper bag found in 1975. That profile was not complete enough to identify the perpetrator at the time of collection, but it contained some markers specific enough to trigger an alert upon encountering a compatible sample in the future. The match between a new DNA sample and a long-stored piece of evidence caused the analysis algorithm to flag Harold's profile at high priority, simultaneously forwarding a notification to the cold case unit of the Louisiana State Police, the unit holding the Grace Murphy file from the 1970s. Almost simultaneously, Grace's blood sample stored under the name Anna in the health system was also matched against Elizabeth Murphy's DNA, which had been submitted to the Missing Persons DNA program earlier. Due to the characteristic genetic patterns of a mother-child relationship, the match reached a high probability level, sufficient for the system to classify Anna as likely belonging to the Murphy family. Two independent alerts appeared close together, one DNA hit linking Harold to the 1975 evidence, and another linking Grace to the missing victim's mother. When CODIS's data connection department noticed that these two alerts pertained to the same case, the file was escalated to emergency priority. An official notification was sent to the cold case unit, marking the first time in over 20 years that the Grace disappearance case had surfaced with clear legal and scientific leads. The cold case unit immediately convened an internal meeting upon receiving the notification. The technical report showed that the match between Harold's DNA and the 1975 evidence achieved a high level of compatibility, given that the bag's DNA was only a partial profile. This indicated Harold had contact with the evidence at the scene around the time Grace disappeared. Simultaneously, the DNA match between Grace Anna and Elizabeth showed a mother-child relationship probability exceeding the required threshold for confirming biological connection. Placed side by side, these two results painted a clear picture. Harold was present at the 1975 scene, and the woman living with him in Lafayette was very likely Grace Murphy. The cold case unit immediately activated a dedicated reinvestigation team to review the entire file. The team consisted of investigators experienced in long-term missing persons cases, forensic specialists, and legal unit representatives to ensure all reinvestigation steps complied with procedures. The team's first task was to retrace Harold's life history based on available data, which was very limited since Harold rarely registered residency. The analysis began by cross-referencing vehicle ownership history, sequences of F-Series truck sales in the Terrebonne Parish area in the mid-1970s, old vehicle repair records, and any documents that could establish Harold's use of a brown F-100 matching the original witness description. When checking repair records at a small garage that operated in Houma the year of the disappearance, they found scattered entries about a truck with side scratches brought in by an owner named Harold. Though the documents lacked full details, this information further supported Harold being among those who owned a vehicle matching the scene. The reinvestigation team also attempted to trace Harold's residency path across different parishes. Checks relied on utility registration records, tax reports, local residency data, court files, and any documents that could pinpoint Harold's location in the years following the disappearance. Results showed a complete absence of verified residency data for Harold in many periods, especially from 1977 to 1985. The exact time Harold was continuously moving between the cabin, Morgan City, and Pierre Part. This disappearance from administrative systems matched the pattern of an individual intentionally avoiding oversight, further strengthening the likelihood of Harold's involvement in the abduction. The investigation team reviewed lists of individuals who lived near mobile home areas in Lafayette in the late 1980s and early 1990s. A few recalled a middle-aged man living with a young woman who rarely communicated and almost never went out. The description matched Harold and Grace, but lacked sufficient legal basis for conclusion. However, it was useful data helping the reinvestigation team define the search scope when approaching the two. When reconnecting Harold's entire timeline, the reinvestigation team noted overlaps between places Harold appeared and routes leading out of Houma in 1975. Geographic analysis showed Harold's movement patterns fitting the model of an abductor intentionally leaving the area right after the event. The DNA results, linking the perpetrator to the scene while confirming Grace's identity, shifted the case to emergency active status, moving the reinvestigation team into the phase of preparing to approach the two subjects living in Lafayette. The DNA results generating two matching alerts forced the reinvestigation team to shift from file analysis to field action, with the first step being to precisely locate where Harold and Grace were residing in Lafayette. The team reviewed hospital records to gather indirect information such as treating physicians' names, admission departments, temporary forms Harold signed, and accompanying administrative notes. Part of the address Harold provided proved invalid, but the hospital still had auxiliary data, like temporary patient file numbers and utility codes used to identify the specific area the patient came from. The investigation team requested additional data from electricity and water companies serving the Lafayette outskirts, using meter numbers, temporary account lists, and bills issued under short-term renter formats. One electricity account was opened under a name, matching the identity Harold provided at the hospital, though without an accompanying social security number. This record linked to a trailer park on the eastern edge of the city, where most renters paid in cash and frequently changed locations. Based on utility information, the reinvestigation team confirmed the trailer park had at least 4 unregistered residency units, fitting the living pattern Harold had maintained for years. The team conducted discreet surveillance of the area, noting the trailer park's overall layout: mobile home units arranged in 2 rows along a gravel road, many abandoned vehicles, poorly maintained common spaces, and irregular foot traffic. This provided conditions for Harold to blend in without drawing attention, consistent with the disjointed movement behavior recorded in the timeline. The investigation team needed to identify which trailer Harold was using. Based on electricity meter numbers and distribution pole positions, they narrowed it down to a unit near the end of the row, showing signs of longer occupancy than others, due to reinforced steps and a temporary rear door sunshade. An old truck parked nearby further supported the hypothesis that Harold lived there, though it was not the F-100 suspected in 1975. During multi-day observations, the team recorded Grace's activities, still under the identity Anna. She only left the trailer for very short periods, usually to fetch items Harold requested or take out trash. No interactions with neighbors, no use of transportation, and no departure beyond a radius of a few dozen meters. Each appearance showed Grace keeping her eyes down, showing no awareness of surroundings. The confined movement pattern aligned with the prolonged control behavior the investigation team had inferred from old files. Once the daily routine was clearly established, the reinvestigation team prepared for direct approach. Procedures required avoiding confrontation with Harold, who was undergoing treatment at the hospital and absent from the trailer park at that time. This created conditions for safely approaching Grace while reducing the risk of panic or threats. 2 investigators disguised as utility service workers knocked on the trailer door. Grace opened it slowly and appeared wary but showed no resistance. When the investigators introduced themselves as law enforcement representatives and requested identity verification, Grace seemed confused. Basic questions about place of birth, year of birth, and relationship to Harold were not answered clearly, similar to hospital records noting that Grace lacked stable identity references. The reinvestigation team followed cold case unit guidelines for medical identification procedures, taking comprehensive photos of Grace and recording physical characteristics like scars, birthmarks, or biological markers comparable to childhood Grace records. Several features match significantly with the original file: the position of a mole on the wrist and forearm bone length aligning with projected growth by age. However, identity confirmation required DNA evidence. Grace was taken to a medical facility for biological sampling in a controlled environment. The sample was sent to the DNA analysis department under expedited procedures. The cold case unit simultaneously requested direct comparison with Elizabeth Murphy's DNA stored in the missing person's DNA program. The matching results showed very high compatibility, exceeding federal thresholds for confirming mother-child blood relation, thereby verifying beyond doubt that Grace Murphy, who disappeared in 1975, was still alive, and was the woman using the identity Anna being approached. This determination ended the 25-year search phase, while establishing full legal grounds to expand investigation into factors related to Harold and the years Grace lived in a controlled state. The DNA verification confirmed that Grace was indeed the victim missing since 1975, forcing the cold case team to shift to the rescue phase under protocols for protecting survivors of long-term captivity. Immediately after the results were confirmed, Grace was removed from the trailer park and transferred to a victim protection center operated by the Louisiana State Police, a facility specializing in cases requiring complete isolation from the previous environment. The team of experts there received Grace without asking stressful questions, focusing on stabilizing her mentally and ensuring her medical safety. Initial examinations showed that Grace was in relatively stable physical health, but exhibited severe withdrawal, limited communication reflexes, and no experience handling basic life situations. The support team immediately developed a care plan based on the model for victims of long-term social isolation. Parallel to the care, necessary legal steps were taken to restore Grace's true identity. Specialists created new civil records, including a reissued birth certificate confirming original details, official medical records, and basic identification documents like a temporary ID for Grace to use during recovery. Since Grace had lived under the identity Anna for many years without any legal records, authorities had to combine DNA evidence, documents from the missing person file, and verification from the Murphy family to fully reconstruct her legal identity. This included severing all legal ties between Grace and Harold, which had never had any legitimate basis to begin with. While Grace received care and underwent legal procedures, the cold case team prepared charges against Harold for multiple offenses, including kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and identity fraud. However, before the arrest warrant could be formally executed, Harold suffered acute heart failure at the hospital, where he was being treated and did not survive. Doctors confirmed Harold's death due to severe cardiovascular complications, causing all criminal proceedings against him to halt at the initial stage. Harold's passing ended the possibility of direct prosecution, but did not affect the determination that he was the sole perpetrator in Grace's kidnapping. The cold case unit completed the investigation report based on DNA evidence, the reconstructed travel history, and indirect testimonies from those who had lived near Harold's residences. All data pointed to a unified conclusion: Harold had kidnapped Grace in 1975, moved through multiple locations to avoid detection, and maintained her captivity until his health forced him to seek medical care, inadvertently creating the opportunity for the case to be solved. Identifying Harold as the sole perpetrator also ruled out the existence of accomplices or a support network. Individuals who had lent Harold housing or known him superficially showed no signs of involvement or knowledge of Grace's captivity. Records indicated Harold acted alone, avoided social contact, and deliberately kept information confined to a narrow circle. This explained why the case went unsolved for decades without anyone in the community ever suspecting. The investigation conclusion was finalized and archived, affirming Harold's full responsibility for Grace's disappearance, while officially closing the perpetrator's chapter in the case that had spanned a quarter century. After Harold's death and Grace's transfer to the Victim Protection Center, the next step authorities had to take was to conduct the official identification process to ensure all information disclosures were based on absolute legal confirmation. The cold case unit collaborated with the medical examination team to compile a list of identifiable features comparable between adult Grace and the 11-year-old Grace from 1975. A file including childhood photos, pre-disappearance medical records, dental information, and biological data served as the foundation. Unique characteristics such as a small scar on the wrist, a mole behind the left ear, and spinal structure previously noted by the family doctor became irreplaceable comparison points. When cross-referenced with Grace's current medical examination, most markers matched, further reinforcing the prior DNA conclusion. Old security records from Grace's school in 1975 were also incorporated into the verification file, including body measurements and estimated height during growth. The examination team compared age-based growth curves and found that adult Grace fully aligned with the projected biological development of an 11-year-old girl from that time. This ensured that not only DNA but also independent medical factors agreed that the woman at the protection center was indeed Grace Murphy. Once the identification process was complete, the Louisiana State Police informed the Murphy family of the results while conducting psychological assessments to prepare for the reunion. Experts recognized that 25 years of isolation made Grace's reactions unpredictable. Therefore, the meeting had to occur in a controlled environment with psychological support staff and security personnel to protect both the victim and the family. Elizabeth and Daniel were brought to a state facility where the space was designed to minimize emotional overload, moderately lit room, soft seating arrangements, staff positioned out of sight but ready to assist. Before the reunion, experts guided Elizabeth on approaching Grace: no tight hugs, no loud speaking, no excessive questions, and letting Grace set the pace of interaction. Daniel was also briefed on necessary boundaries, as overly strong reactions could cause Grace to panic or withdraw based on reflexes developed from years in a controlled environment. When Grace was brought into the reunion room, she appeared confused, walking slowly and looking down, consistent with behavior observed by the cold case team in prior days. Elizabeth stood at a safe distance as instructed, hands trembling slightly, but maintaining a calm voice as she called her daughter's name. That sound, once familiar to Grace before 1975, but completely absent from her auditory memory for years, caused Grace to pause. The room fell silent enough to hear everyone's breathing. Grace looked up, her eyes wavering with confusion as she faced the woman a few steps away. Although unable to recognize Elizabeth through direct memory, the face, features, and voice triggered a clear emotional response. Grace did not step back or cower, but stood still, as if part of her sensed inherent safety in the blood connection. Elizabeth took one very slow step forward, asking if she wanted to come closer. Grace hesitated, then nodded slightly. That was the first sign allowing Elizabeth to close the distance. Daniel observed from behind, holding back emotion. The family finally stood near each other for the first time since that morning in 1975, but without the dramatic embraces often depicted in media reunions. Instead, they connected gently, cautiously, and in line with Grace's psychological state. The on-site psychologist noted Grace's response level as positive, no overstimulation, no signs of panic, and able to maintain eye contact for short periods. This allowed the meeting to extend, enabling Elizabeth and Daniel to share simple statements about themselves, where they lived, how they had searched for Grace, but without delving into traumatic details. The entire reunion was recorded for archival purposes to assess Grace's behavioral adjustments and emotional responses in the post-rescue phase. The session ended when Grace showed signs of fatigue, and the support team decided to let her rest. Though the reunion was cautious and highly restricted, it established the initial foundation for reconnecting Grace with her family, a journey requiring much time, but beginning with a safe meeting after 25 years of complete separation. The first reunion between Grace and her family was not only an emotional milestone, but also the start of a more critical phase: functional recovery and building a roadmap for social reintegration after 25 years lived entirely under control. Immediately after the meeting ended, the state's psychological team conducted a comprehensive assessment to determine the extent of trauma, adaptability, and long-term support needs for Grace. Results showed no violent behavior, no acute panic reactions, but deep withdrawal, high vigilance reflexes, limited language ability, and lack of basic adult social skills. This evaluation became the basis for a multi-layered support plan, including psychological therapy, life skills training, medical care, and creating safe communication environments to restore functions. Grace never had the chance to develop. Experts determined the process must be slow, without pressure, focused on re-establishing a sense of safety, something Grace had not experienced since age 11. Parallel to psychological support, the legal team began addressing identification documents. Since Grace had been cut off from all civil systems since 1975, she had no activity records for over 2 decades, making identity restoration key to independent living. The legal department applied for reissued birth certificate, social security number, medical records, and residency documents. Some procedures required cross-referencing old missing person files with new DNA results for legality. As Grace had used the identity Anna, authorities ensured this name was removed from all unofficial records to prevent future confusion. Additionally, since Grace had lived with someone using false identities, legal specialists clarified that Grace had no involvement in any fraudulent acts Harold committed over the years. This protected Grace legally, ensuring no liability for events during her captivity. Once initial procedures were complete, Grace entered a social reintegration program for long-term isolation victims. This process required time and close specialist support. Grace had to relearn basic skills, using money, shopping, navigating public spaces, and establishing simple social interactions. A dedicated specialist was assigned as a companion to guide Grace through each small step. They started with light exercises in safe environments, such as recognizing nonverbal cues, responding appropriately to new situations, and building confidence in approaching the outside world. Grace also received medical support to improve health after years of neglect. Family contact was adjusted to her adaptability, short visits, gradually increasing frequency, always monitored by psychologists for overload risks. Elizabeth and Daniel learned to communicate appropriately with an adult with severe isolation history. Emotions had to be regulated to avoid pressuring Grace. Initial progress was slow but steady. Grace began using more words, maintaining longer eye contact, and asking simple questions about life experiences she had missed. Each change reflected her adaptability back to the real world, though the journey remained long. The post-reunion phase thus became the most pivotal shift in Grace's life since her separation, a journey rebuilding what should have been hers since age 11, from personal identity and life skills to trusting a safe environment. The final steps in restoring Grace's identity and reintegration ran parallel to authorities finalizing the case report, where many key questions remained unanswered, despite identifying the perpetrator. One of the biggest mysteries was how Harold approached Grace, and why he chose that specific morning in 1975 to act. No evidence confirmed Harold had observed the Murphy family long-term or was merely coincidentally in the neighborhood that day, as he left no activity traces in Houma before the disappearance. The cabin deep in the swamp raised questions about Harold's familiarity with the terrain, or possible help from others, but no evidence showed accomplices or support networks. Individuals who had provided temporary housing or rentals in Morgan City, Pierre Part, or Lafayette were vetted and showed no involvement in the captivity. Another mystery involved the F-100 truck. Physical evidence and witness statements linked the vehicle directly to the kidnapping, but old transfer records from that era were too fragmented to determine if the truck belonged to Harold before or after the side scratch repair. This left reconstructing the vehicle's timeline, a factor that could strengthen the investigation, with a critical missing link. Nonetheless, conclusions about Harold's role based on DNA evidence and travel timeline were solid enough to recognize him as the sole perpetrator. When evaluating why the case lasted 25 years, investigators highlighted the transformative role of DNA technology. The extremely weak DNA from the 1975 paper bag was unusable early on, but late 1990s advancements allowed a partial profile valuable for later breakthrough. The match between Harold's DNA and the evidence opened half the door, completed by Elizabeth's DNA data, enabling the federal system to identify Grace, despite her new identity. Grace's case was featured in professional workshops as a prime example of long-term evidence preservation and updating relatives' DNA. Fully operational CODIS and NCIC created data connections unimaginable in the 1970s. This was a rare case where both victim and offender were identified through separate DNA lines, merging into one conclusion. Victim recovered, offender deceased, case resolved. This official statement was issued by Louisiana State Police in the closing report, confirming the Grace Murphy case no longer unidentified but resolved, despite no trial. Though resolved, societal impact continued. Media portrayed Grace's case as a powerful reminder that long-term disappearances do not always end in tragedy, and scientific advances can provide search opportunities even after decades of isolation. Local agencies viewed it as a profound lesson on initial errors, reliance on unverified statements, misallocated search resources, and lack of database integration. These delayed breakthrough for decades, salvaged only by DNA application. For the Houma community, the case became collective memory of the Murphy family's persistent hope and the power of never giving up. Cold case experts emphasized maintaining victim files, annual updates, and evidence preservation as essential for reopening when technology evolves. These lessons continue influencing Louisiana missing persons protocols, strengthening requirements for long-term evidence storage, relative DNA updates, and data interoperability, post-Grace Murphy. In the story of Grace Murphy, the most haunting aspect is not just the 25 years of captivity, but how each small detail, if handled better, could have changed a child's fate. In 1975 Louisiana, there was no Amber Alert, no security cameras. Police misjudged the danger level, diverted resources to swamps instead of focusing on the brown Ford F-100 and the list of 27 owners, including Harold Boudreaux, with his vague alibi. Today in the United States, we have more tools, nationwide alerts, CODIS, NCIC, cameras everywhere. But Grace's lesson is that technology cannot replace human attention and family community persistence. Elizabeth visited the sheriff's office yearly to update the missing person file. Daniel carried guilt for losing sight of Grace in minutes, then joined his mother in submitting DNA when the National Missing Persons DNA program launched. Those small persistent actions combined with DNA science created the DNA hit, linking Grace Segudiana to her mother and Harold to the 1975 paper bag. In modern American life, this reminds us never ignore unusual signs around children, a strange vehicle appearing repeatedly in the neighborhood, an adult watching kids too closely. Never hesitate to report suspicions, and if a loved one is missing, never stop updating files, submitting DNA, staying in contact with investigators. It also reminds the system, learn from past mistakes, cross-verify statements, avoid letting media pressure derail investigations, because sometimes the chance to find another Grace Murphy comes only once in a lifetime. Thank you for joining the inspiring and hopeful story of Grace Murphy. If you'd like to continue exploring other journeys toward justice, remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. See you in the next episode, where every story reminds us that persistence can change an entire life.